My earliest memory of learning the story of the first Thanksgiving is from preschool. In our preschool class, we made pilgrim hats out of black construction paper with square yellow buckles. And we made Native American headbands that were simply a strip of brown paper wrapped around your head with a single feather cut out of red or yellow or orange paper sticking straight up. I think my parents still have a picture or two of me in one of those hats somewhere. Now, I don't remember exactly what we learned about the story of Thanksgiving. I'm sure it focused on sharing and friendship and saying thank you, those simple concepts that 3- and 4-year-old minds could grasp and learn something from. But what I do remember are those hats, and having the distinct feeling that there was something about those pilgrim hats that made them much better than the Native American hats. I don't know why. I was 4, right? But I was pretty confident that it was true. It was one of my early moments of indoctrination into the system of white supremacy. In elementary school, the story became a little clearer. There were brave pilgrims who had suffered a long and hard winter, and then there were the kind Native Americans who came and taught them how to grow the right kind of crops for this strange new land. Some of the Native Americans were less nice, we learned, but we focused on the nice ones and on a story of the first Thanksgiving that was a picture-perfect cross-cultural experience of hospitality and generosity. We didn't make hats anymore. Instead, we connected dots together and colored pictures of the pilgrims. We worked on word searches with words such as turkey and corn and Plymouth. And I remember that there was some point at which I started to feel a little uncomfortable with this Pollyanna version of the first Thanksgiving. Now, this probably coincided with the year that my mother got fed up with the story we were learning in school about pilgrims and Native Americans happily coexisting in the early 17th century. And she decided she needed to set the record straight for us. So, she got a children's book about Thanksgiving written from the perspective of a Native American and read it to us as part of our Thanksgiving celebrations. Needless to say, it wasn't the most celebratory part of our day. But it was then that my conception of the first Thanksgiving started to include the blankets that early European colonists gave to the Native Americans that were filled with smallpox. I started to put together the fact that the pilgrims hadn't actually come to a land that was uninhabited. They had just come to a land that wasn't inhabited in the way they were used to. And I got annoyed at the pilgrims and the generations after the pilgrims for all of the promises that they made to Native Americans and then subsequently broke. I started to wonder about how that first story that I had learned about hospitality and gratitude was supposed to fit into this new narrative. And being a logical and curious child, I wanted to know which story was really true. Now, often, when we consider the notion of truth as Unitarian Universalists, we fall into the bottomless pit of moral relativism. We talk about everything as a matter of perspective, each of us finding our own truth. We hesitate to claim that anything at all is certain. And we love to tell that story of the elephant and the blind men. How many of you know this old Buddhist tale? It's okay, I'm going to tell it again. It is said that a number of disciples once went to the Buddha and complained that there were too many wandering scholars who were fighting about the nature of the world. In response, the Buddha told this story. There was once a king who called to a servant and bade him to gather all the blind men who lived in the city and to show them an elephant. So the servant assembled all the blind men and brought in an elephant and presented to each of them to touch a certain part of the elephant. To one he presented the head, to another the ears, to another the tusk, and so on, with each man feeling a different part, a different piece of the elephant. Now, as each man felt their different piece of the elephant, the king went to each of them and said, "Well, what have you learned? What sort of thing is an elephant?" And of course, each man responded with something different. The man who had felt the head said, "An elephant is like a pot." And the man who had felt the ear replied, "An elephant is just like a winnowing basket." And the man who had felt the tusk said, "Oh no, an elephant is like a plowshare." And soon they all fell to fighting about what an elephant was really like. And so, the Buddha concluded his story, are these blind men just like the fighting scholars? Each one claims a different version of reality, but they are simply describing different perspectives on the singular phenomenon of existence. Now, I will admit that I love this story, and I think it is a great way to talk about things like God and the afterlife, but I also find it inadequate for almost any questions of truth that go beyond mere philosophic ponderings. While this story does a nice job of pointing out that we all have different perspectives on any given situation, it neglects to take into account the ways our differing levels of power and privilege affect how each perspective gets heard. In the story of the first Thanksgiving, the perspective of the Pilgrims and the perspective of the Native Americans are not simply two different perspectives with equal weight and equal importance. Throughout our history, the stories told by European Americans have always been given more weight than the stories told by people of color, including Native Americans. Until recently, they were often the only stories that were told. The truth about both our history books and our present-day mainstream media is that they privilege the perspectives of people in power. So we hear more about the 50 pilgrims who died in that first winter in Massachusetts than the thousands of Native Americans who died as a result of disease and violence brought on by the colonists. We hear more about our president-elect's tweets than we do about the hundreds of water protectors who are putting their bodies on the line to protect their sacred land out in North Dakota. This privileging of narratives is inevitable in a country like ours that is built on empire and white supremacy. We see the legacy of the colonial origins of the United States every day. We see it in the celebration of holidays like Columbus Day and Thanksgiving, these days that lift up and honor people and events that Native Americans associate with slaughter and theft. We see it in the names of the towns and rivers and mountains here in New England, borrowed from British and French landmarks rather than the names given to those places by the indigenous people who have been here for so many thousands of years longer. We see it in our history and literature classes that teem with the stories and the writings of white men, where we need to set aside a particular month to read about women and a particular month to read about black folks. We see it even in that moment when we are 4 years old and somehow know that we should like the pilgrim hat just a little bit more than the Native American feather headband. The really insidious thing about colonialism is that it infiltrates our very consciousness, right? In the early days of the American colonies, it was religion that taught the colonists that they were superior to the Native Americans they found in this land. These days, it is centuries of only hearing the stories of people who have power that teaches us the same thing. The modern day legacy of colonialism is that we have a whole narrative about who we are and where our country came from that has been told almost exclusively through the perspective of white men. It is a narrative that traps us in cycles of oppression. It's a narrative that traps us in the soul-sucking system of white supremacy. It's a narrative that imprisons all of us in a single perspective of whose lives are really important. It is as if all we know about that elephant is that it feels like a winnowing basket. If that were the only story that we got from those blind men, all we would know of the elephant would be its ear. We would see only one very small part of the picture. We would not know anything about the real truth of the elephant or even the truths of those other blind men. We would be stuck with the narrow vision of one man, one truth, one story, even though we know the real experience of life is so much more than that. Now, the first step in breaking free, since Chuck talked to us about freedom, is recognizing the singular narrative, the single story in which we are trapped. And the second step is beginning to listen for and lift up other voices, the voices of those who have been pushed to the margins for far too many years. This work of changing and challenging the dominant narratives in our society is work that we are called to by the core principles of our faith. We are called by our belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. We are called by our belief that our liberation is all bound up with the liberation of every other person, that we truly can't be free until all are free. We are called to lift up the voices, the stories of the marginalized. And we are called to dismantle the harmful narrative of white supremacy that has set itself in our consciousness. We are called to actively work to change the story. This is why Unitarian Universalists across the country have been rising up in solidarity with the Standing Rock Sioux in their fight to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline. After the original planned route of the pipeline had been rejected by a white community it was supposed to run through, the pipeline was rerouted through the lands of the Standing Rock Sioux. For more than 6 months now, a camp of prayerful, peaceful water protectors have been resisting that pipeline. These water protectors have set up camp to protect their land granted by one of those many treaties that have been made and broken with Native Americans over the years. Earlier this week, as families across the country were out buying pumpkin puree and stuffing mix, the water protectors of North Dakota were being sprayed with water cannons and tear gas by police in riot gear as temperatures crept further and further below freezing. One could not watch this unreasonable violence without hearkening back to the violence of those early colonists against the people they found inhabiting lands they wanted for their use. It is a familiar story. It's a story that has played itself over and over again throughout the short history of European presence in the Americas. It's a story that continues to this day, and it's a story that we need to start telling. As Unitarian Universalists, we are called to lift up the voices of the oppressed and marginalized. We are called to listen first, to listen, and to be in solidarity, to follow the lead of those who have been silenced for far, far too long. In this time, in this moment, as we have all become more aware than ever of all the isms that continue to plague our country, this is a vital part of our work for justice. The man who thought that the elephant was like a winnowing basket needs to begin to listen to the man who thought the elephant was like a plowshare, and the man who thought the elephant was like a pot. We need all of these perspectives, all of these stories to know the truth of our world, to begin to even grasp at what that truth might look like. We need all of our stories to be heard if we are going to have any chance at all of making this world more whole.
Tons of gold.